Hello, and welcome to the last of our exercises about model creation, and we also had the advanced sample selection in this section of the course as well. This one is exercise 401, simple qualitative models. Remember back to the introductory lessons, the 4 lectures that we started the course with. One of them was discussing qualitative models. And these are models that are looking at our samples, and they're making some sort of a qualitative determination, which will normally end up with either a pass or a fail result. In contrast to our quantitative models, those are the ones that are predicting the compositional value of, some sort of a compositional value for our sample, or some sort of a property like a hardness, for example, or a digestibility or something like that. But the quantitative models ends up with the numerical results. The qualitative models are doing an evaluation of the spectra, and we are assigning it and doing a similarity measurement to predefined groups. And based on this similarity and this evaluation, we are giving our samples a pass or a fail. Applications here are a simple conformity test. Does the sample look like it's supposed to? Based on the history that I've seen before, and all the samples that I've seen before, does this sample fit within those boundaries, or is it outside for some reason and I'm going to fail it? Okay, so that's one of the common ones. You could be looking at 2 or 3 different groups and saying, does this sample fit closest to group 1, group 2, or group 3? You might also be looking for example, an adulterant. And this goes to food safety. And I think there are a lot of opportunities here with near infrared in food and animal feed production. The classic example here is melamine. Melamine has a very distinctive peak, a very distinctive spectral artifact. And you can easily set up models that will pick up a melamine adulteration in different milk powders to try and skew the protein assays and make it appear that the milk powders have more protein than they do. So these are pretty simple models to set up. And they've got, I think that this is a little bit of an untouched area of near infrared, and it's growing significantly. A nice thing about these models also is that they're relatively easy to go in and try. With the quantitative models, we have to send our samples off for reference analyses, and often this is expensive. With qualitative models, all we need to know is what group they belong to, either pass-fail or group 1, group 2, group 3. And normally we know that without sending a sample to a laboratory. So these are the kind of experiments that you can do quickly and determine whether or not this has got a value for your company. The last thing I will add about qualitative models is that if you remember the structure of U-scan, when you're setting up a product, you have one scan method, one calibration method, and you combine those into a product. It has to be at least one calibration method, but it can be more. So you can make a product that has a calibration method based on a quantitative model. So that's giving your protein, fat, fiber, whatever results. But you can have a second calibration method that's based on a qualitative assay that's giving a pass-fail results. So every time you scan a sample, you're getting both quantitative and qualitative results back. So I think this is a very interesting part of near infrared. So let's jump into it. Exercise 401. Okay. To access qualitative calibrations, you can just open up an SVF file, a spectra file. The menu changes at the top. You can go into calibrate, calculate, qualitative calibration. You get a model window. It's got the spectra file that you had highlighted in the input section already. There are different types of assays where you might have more than one file in there, for example. And you can go in and add those files in, and they will just be listed here. I just also want to note based on the file, the constituents that are present in that file. It will also show your passing and failing samples in there, or positive and negative samples, okay? I would encourage everybody, and this is part of the exercise, but open up this file and you will see how the constituents are set up. So the pass-fail is based on a constituent value of a 1 or 2. And you can see, for example, in this training file, how that is set up and how the qualitative regression evaluates those constituents. There's also a section to make a validation file. That's here. This is the second part of the exercise. It's very difficult to do a cross-validation with qualitative regressions and qualitative evaluations. So it's really important that you have a completely independent validation file. Again, this is the second part of the exercise, but in your production, in your model creation, make sure that you have a real validation file to evaluate. Finally, at the bottom, here's your output file. The extension for qualitative models are QVF. So that's where you put in your model file name. Brings up a file IO box, you give it a name and where you want it to go, and you can store. You then can go into the options screen. The top of the options screen is one you've seen before. You can use your standard 1881 SNV and DTrend math treatment. If you remember, the purpose of the math treatment is to minimize or ignore the characteristics of the spectra that don't help us get where we want to go. And these math treatments, this math treatment, kind of the default, is minimizing some of the effects of the instrumentation of the grind, the sample size, things like that. So it's a good first place to start. Segments, I'd look at the core sweet spot of your NIR spectrum, 1100 or so to 2500 nanometers in general. But if you're looking at an adulterant, for example, you can scan those samples, go into your graphics, determine, are there any unique peaks with your adulterant? And if there are, I would recommend that you narrow down your segments to focus on that wavelength region where the adulterant peaks are. It's just going to make your model that much more specific to detect that adulterant. You've got different algorithms or calculations to determine your qualitative model. These are described very well in the help. They are slightly different than you've seen before, but I would check into the help file for a good explanation of your algorithms. There are some that are based on the raw spectra. There are a couple of based on also on mathematical reductions in principal components. So go ahead and take a look at those. And finally, we've got limits. So we've got our standard deviations, our distances, and probability. You've got action levels and warnings based on this. And you've also got a false positive, false negative penalty ratio. And we're going to talk about this, okay? So you can either set the limits automatically or you can set them manually. And the exercise will walk it through. There are benefits to both. I think I would start out setting the limits automatically and adjusting based on this ratio, but you'll see once you get comfortable with the process that you can actually set them manually. These limits will also be important when you bring your QVF file back into UScan. So you will make a calibration method based on the QVF file. It will recognize it as standard distance or a probability limit system, and then it will ask you for the limits, okay? So here, as in the software, and when you're going through your validation is where you're going to set those limits. Here's the segments window. Again, I think the best use here is you've got a known adulterant or you've got a known effect or something that happens in the process. If you can find an area of the spectra that is visibly different based on a negative or fail result, I would narrow your qualitative investigation to that segment. It'll make it more specific. And then you can go in and click on calculate, and it's going to jump into a results window. One of the things I also would like you to look at when you're looking at your the SVF file that we've got in the exercises is look at the structure of the file. The structure of the file is putting all of the positives first and then putting all of the negatives afterwards. You could reverse that, but it's very handy for the evaluations, and you'll see shortly in graphics if you keep all of your positives together and you keep all of your negatives together, okay? This is the one of the files that you'll be working with. You can see the results. They're expressed as a standardized value and a probability. If we remember, the standardized value is 0 to whatever. It's a distance measurement, so it's going off theoretically, I guess, to infinity. The further away from 0, the further you are from being a member of that group or being similar to that group. So with a standardized value, you would set a limit, and anything above that limit would be a failure, okay? Would be a negative. You can see what the action limit here is 2.99, and you can see, for example, these two samples are getting close, so they're in a warning situation, okay? Probability is a scale from 0 to 1, where 1 is a perfect match and 0 is a fail. So you can see these two values are getting very close to 0, and they've got a warning, okay? If you remember back to our lesson that we were talking about qualitative analysis, you might want to use standardized distances or probability depending on your situation. And also it's kind of about a comfort level with the users. I think some people understand probability better. Probability has a little bit of a compressed scale, and sometimes the limits, go to 3 decimal places or 4 decimal places. It's a little bit harder to evaluate, I think, than a standardized value where the scale is expanded a little bit. But there might be cases where either one of the systems works better for your situation. After you get that table of results, there's a graph. You can choose either standardized or probability predictions. And again, I just described those two systems. And here's where having a sorted file is useful. We've got the passes, positives, and the negatives, the fails over here. So you can see that junction, and that's where the structure of your file. You can look at probability or distances here, and you can see how the limits are set up. So it gives you a visual indication about what samples will pass, which ones will be warnings, and which ones will be failures. Here's the probability graph, okay? And if you look at this, you can see that the limits as you're approaching 0 get to be failures, and it's got a very compressed scale. So for most cases, I find that the distance is more instinctive for me, and I like the expanded scale. I think it's easier to work with. But if you've got clear delineations between your groups, for example, and not many samples in the gray areas, probability could be a great choice for you as well. And you can click on Write File, and you can make your QBF file. And again, once you have this QBF file, you can just import that, bring that into your calibration method and UScan and configure it into a product. So looking at those deviations or the z-stats, one of the things you're trying to do from a theoretical perspective is you're trying to figure out in this gray area between false negatives and true positives, or true negatives and false positives, where this action limit is. And if you step back, I think everybody needs to make a determination about where their liability with this qualitative assay is. In other words, do they want to skew their system to be overly sensitive and possibly get a couple of false positives that they go in and they do a further determination and they found out, no, that sample's fine? Or are they worried about getting too many false flags out there? This is specific to what you are trying to do with the assay. But if you have too many false positives, you can raise the false positive, false negative ratio. If you remember, that was in the options when you're doing this in automatic mode. And you're raising the penalty for the false positives. If you're working in manual mode, you can lower the action limits. Okay? They both have the same effect. You're just doing it automatically with the software or manually. If you've got too many false negatives and you want to push the system in that direction, you can lower the false positive, false negative ratio to less than 1 in manual mode. Okay? So if you've got a false negative, you're not detecting a sample. Okay? So 1 is slipping through. In most cases, you want the actual positives. This is, for example, an adulteration. If it's positive for an adulteration, you need to find those. And if you find a couple of samples that are in the gray area, you do an investigation and you turn out that the sample is fine, that's not a big penalty. Your instrument is still doing a good job of screening, but the penalty for having a positive slip through is very high. In this case, you can discourage false negatives by reducing the value, that ratio. Okay? If you've got 20 actual positives and 4 false negatives, so samples that slip through, you can lower this ratio to increase your detections. And again, if you can do this also in manual mode by raising the limit. So this is a case where you really need to, I would recommend that you just jump into the exercises. The exercises, once you see the structure of the file, and then you go through the regression and you look at how these samples are being picked out, and you understand in the background that we're just predicting numbers based on similarity, and we're assigning it into a group. And you can manipulate those limits so that the assignments that you're doing are in sync with your needs from this assay. I think you'll get a real good feel for qualitative analyses. Then beyond that, as you're working through all of these files, I think most people, when they jump into near infrared, they're focused on quantitative analyses, and that makes sense. That's historically what we've done. But you'll be generating a lot of files. And if you've got some sort of a pass-fail investigation, a pass-fail evaluation that you would like to do on these samples, I would encourage you to jump in and do that. Remember, in most cases, you don't need reference analyses, so it's relatively inexpensive to do this. It just takes a little computer time. And if it is an effective evaluation for you, you can just add this model on top of your quantitative model, and you've got a really comprehensive product evaluation. Okay, and with that, let's jump into a real quick demo and take a look at qualitative analysis. So if we open up UCal 4 and we go into our structure here under qualitative models, we can go into a first exercise. You can play around with the files if you'd like in 4.2. We do not have an exercise for that, but it's some more models, files for you to work with. Okay, so if we jump into 401 and we can use this flower train file, SCF file. If we go into calibrate, calculate qualitative calibration, it brings up this dialog. And again, you've got your file in here. You've got a validation file, and there are validation files in here, and you'll see that later on in your exercise. It's going to require me to do an output file, a QVF file, and then we can jump into options. So if you follow along in the exercise, we will set this up again with our standard settings here. One of the things it's recommended here is that you go in and you change the wavelength segments. And again, this is something that you're going to have to work around with. And the graphics program can be very, very useful for this. For example, if you have, in this case, we're looking at an is hard. Is it hard wheat or is it soft wheat? So this is something that we knew Did the flour come from hard wheat or soft wheat? So we knew this ahead of time. If you put this file into graphics, you can plot this out. In fact, you could do different things. If you think about it, you could put a bunch of soft flour samples in one SVF file, hard in the other, and compare those two in graphics and do even a subtraction between those two, and you could determine the differences. And you might find wavelength areas that are very hypervariable, very distinct between those two. So this is a case where we know that this area of the spectra contains information that is useful for this assay. We're going to change the limits here to 5 and 4.5. And everything else I think will be okay. We can start out with cosine similarity. There are different ways in here. Cosine similarity, if you remember, is just similar to correlation. It's very fast, very easy. These are also based on raw spectra. And then there are two models here that are based on PCA. PCA similarity and a kind of a residuals, PCA residuals. So we'll start out with cosine similarity, and we go in and we can calculate. So the model is being calculated very quickly, and it's done, and it's going to present us with that table. So you can see that we've got a number of passes, some warnings, and some fails. So depending on what we're doing, we might want to adjust our limits or push that ratio up or down, okay? So you can see the reference here. The result is a true positive. These are the values for that sample based on a standardized value of evaluation or a probability, and whether or not it passed. In other words, whether or not it matched. So these are true positives. You can see that this one is a false negative. Okay, so it failed. And here's one that's right on the edge. We can go in and look at this in graphics also. And this is where it's very nice to order your samples. You can see that we've got positives and then negatives, and you can see where our threshold is. Okay, so the threshold, I think, in this file is right around here, possibly here. I don't remember. But you know, if you've got them ordered and sorted in your SVF file, separating out positives and negatives based on your constituent value, and once you get into graphics, it gives you an easy way to look at it. You can look at it in probability. I really don't like this mode. I find it harder to evaluate than the distances for most assays. Okay. So that's the end of it. And once you get to the point that you're comfortable, you can write your file. In this case, if I wanted to push my assay in one direction or not, I could go here and I could change my false positive, false negative penalty ratio, raising or lower the limits, depending on which way I want my evaluation to lean and which way it reflects the liability or the penalty that I'm going to pay if I'm wrong in my particular evaluation. So that's a quick demo of qualitative analysis. Jump right in, please, and look at exercise 401, and 402 files are there too if you want to do multi-product evaluations. Thank you, everyone.